today. I think it's also important to discuss this from a strategy, innovation, and design perspective. And I also want to kind of show what we are doing in IBM Client Engineering and how we are using the principles of this approach to kind of foster the innovation journey of our clients, and also to promote more user-centric solutions and better experiences. So it makes sense to start from defining what value-based selling actually is. Starting from a definition of value that kind of caught my attention. This is from Seth Godin's blog, the famous marketing guru, which reminds us that value is not the price, is it? Or is not just the price of an item. So two items that retail with a different price might have cost the same to produce. But even if we know that, we are still willing to pay for that price difference. And if you're not into wine, I think the metaphor applies to literally anything. And the reason why you're willing to pay for that price difference lies in something bigger. And that something bigger is what the product does for you. And this is exactly what you want to demonstrate when you play around with value-based selling. So value-based selling really articulates this idea about sales as being broader than just shipping a product and more about co-creating a solution with customers. The backdrop of this is that there's been a shift over the last decades from seeing sales as primarily as a product or supply-centric process to focusing much more seriously on the customer. So I'm going to give you a brief and very simplistic overview of the evolution of the sales epistemology. So in the past decades, it was primarily all about feature selling, and that was kind of ideal because there would always be a straightforward way to map a product capability to a specific business problem. But as problems became more complex and competition kept growing around the same very products, we reached a point where companies started to sprint away from product and feature selling and embrace solution selling, whereby they would create different versions of products for different needs. So they would basically try to cater for different customer segments. And that really took off during the 80s, and particularly with companies who had highly customized products or would sell packages, mobile companies, for instance, but also IT companies who would provide additional services, say maintenance or security, on top of their existing platforms. Those will likely provide bundles for each of the different customers. And actually, this led to product differentiation and to design more sophisticated kind of products, and actually would fit into a differentiation leadership kind of strategy. But with competition ever growing, and also with a customer base that was becoming more intelligent, and I will come back to this concept shortly, we reached a point where competing just on differentiation was still necessary, but not sufficient to secure a deal. And this is the point where we started to put an emphasis on this concept of value in the sales setting. At first, as a kind of generic value selling, whereby sellers will provide buyers with very generic examples of the value that would accrue to other organizations through the use of their solutions. So it's something that was really kind of convenient from a sales rep's perspective, because they would just whisk out a preset success story to kind of show the value of their solutions. But soon they realized that this kind of approach was a little bit too generic, too wishy-washy, and it would never persuade customers to kind of buy the products or buy into the products. And so this is the point where we started to talk about more specific or differentiated methodologies for value-based selling. And this is the point where we are today. So value-based selling really is an approach to sales that really focuses on how a product or a service provides value to a customer, rather than focusing just on price, on products features. And what is it that qualifies value-based selling? There's this strong focus on customer needs. So we are still in solution selling realm. So we are still in this kind of customization kind of domain. There is a quantification of the value, and this is very distinctive of value-based selling, because as in the previous talk, we touched upon this point. Value can be is a mouthful of a word, and it can be really difficult to kind of pinpoint to specific something. But if you're able to prove the value of your solution in terms of higher efficiency or increased revenues or employee retention or customer satisfaction, then you put a number behind these vague words. And this is what value sellers do. They quantify that value. They just put a number by it and against a specific business problem. This is important because actually in this way, by quantifying, by putting a number, you are able to better communicate the reason why customers should buy into your solution. And at the same time, customers are really able to understand what is the impact on the business model, on the business problem, on the ecosystem. And crucially, they can do that before committing financially to a particular solution. So there is also this de-risking kind of element, which is kind of appealing for them. Conversations in value-based selling are quite particular and are different from the typical sales conversation because they're far more engaging and far more interactive. And also, sellers are taking on a more consultative approach. They're really striving to guide the customers into taking informed decisions, which ideally, of course, should lead also to the purchase of a particular solution. Why now? Why do we need a new way of selling, first of all, and why now in particular? So there are the backdrop to all of these is that something has changed in the sales world, and there are several challenges, and primarily they concern the sales teams. I don't want to talk about unprecedented challenges, but of course, sales teams today are facing challenges that are tougher than in the past. Global uncertainties such as the COVID-19 crisis, wars, inflation, other cyclical crises unfurling in our economy are really ushered in a new era of customer caution. So companies are making only the most essential expenditures. There's high level of financial scrutiny, and this is making things tougher for sellers. But also there is a process which started with the advent of the internet and which is sort of magnified today, whereby easy access to information has kind of shifted the balance of power from the seller to the customer. In the past, customer would just pick up the phone, call a company and ask to speak to a sales rep. But since the advent of the internet, that concept has been literally turned on its head. So now customers can really have information on products. They can request demo, they can read other people's opinions, they can look at different use cases on the web. So really the balance of power has shifted, and customers are typically entering the sales process much more knowledgeable and much more opinionated about a particular product. 77% of buyers say they contact a salesperson only after have carried out the due diligence, their own research on a particular product. And this is making things a little bit tougher for sellers. And on top of that, and amidst increasing pressures to reduce cost, there is also this a mounting skepticism around generic promises of product performances, and companies are asking more and more a tangible proof of the value of these solutions. But I think that by far the most important element that makes the case for value-based selling goes beyond sales actually, and is about the increasing complexity of the business problem space. Which as a result has an impact on the sales setting, as I said, because companies today are facing really tough challenges and what we call wicked problems. So problems that are ill-defined, ill-formulated, where there's lots of confusion, lots of ambiguity, there's a plethora of stakeholders, no one is really talking with the other, no one is really understanding what the other has to say, and crucially where you don't see the impact, the long-term impact on your solution, on your ecosystem, how it's trickling down on your employees, your customers, all your systems. So you don't see the long-term effect on your innovation roadmap. Those are the wicked problems. And companies are really asking sometimes salespeople to kind of understand these problems and to account for them, which is really, really difficult for them to do. So this is the backdrop of the storm that sales teams are called to weather. And really value-based selling is, we can define it as the last incarnation of solution selling, but in an era of increased competition and increased complexity. And the promise of value-based selling really is to, the sales argument is not anymore, I've got a specific product for your specific need, but it's more about, with my solution, you're going to achieve X and Y. I'm going to measure this value. I'm going to measure this value against your very problem. And this is good from both sides, because it is easily, for customers can relate, can understand when a solution relates to their particular problem. They can understand the impact, and also is, for them, is de-risking, because they can actually understand that before committing financially to a particular solution. One key element of value-based selling is really co-creation. This is key, and methodology-wise is what really sets value-based selling apart from other types of sales. And it's really about involving customers into the creation of this value, into the creation of a solution. And actually what co-creation is all about is an exchange of resources among different actors. So actors interact together, and they do share resources, they integrate other actors' resources, and they crucially, they do create also other resources along the way, along a learning process, a kind of learning process. And that's really key. And also co-creation actually has another benefit, because it kind of create engagement around the sales process. So it creates an experience around this process, and this is really important, because, and I'm still stealing from Seth Godin's blog here, the price of an item is obvious. It can be seen from a mile away, but value is more subtle, and it often needs to be experienced to be understood. So what value-based selling says is, if you are able to tangibly show what they stand to gain from a particular solution, how it's going to impact the business model, the business problems, you are framing an intriguing value propositions that your prospects, your clients are going to be receptive to. Now, I want to investigate more the relationship between value-based selling and design thinking, because I'm assuming that most of you tuning in today are designers, and we touched upon some things that might sound incredibly familiar to you: wicked problems, user centricity, and co-creation. And actually, I would argue that design thinking not only resonates with the value-based selling scenario, but can actually elevate it into a real path to innovation, and a path to innovation to the design of better experiences and more user-centric experiences. This is the high-level process for value-based selling, and you can see how it is tremendously adhering to the high steps, the high-level steps of the design thinking framework. So there is an understanding, there is an exploration kind of part, there is a problem definition kind of phase, and then we go the prototyping, the solution, the making phase, when we do create those artifacts, the kind of make the value feasible and make the solution visible, and make the solution kind of tangible. So this is really, understanding problem statement and creating. And this is a framework, and I like to think of frameworks as of recipes. Any framework, that could be a strategy framework, a marketing framework, and recipes. You've got a recipe of an apple pie, and all your ingredients are there. But then, if you use your ingredients in a different way, you might create a recipe which is still an apple pie, but it better suits your liking. And also frameworks work like that, in my opinion. And this is actually the high-level framework for this is the take on this recipe that we have in a client engineering team in IBM. This is the high-level framework, and we call it the value engineering framework, that we use in IBM to kind of break the wicked problems down and co-create with customers the solution to specific problems that we do identify. This is a very simplified version. Actually, the model is much more articulated, because there's lots of engagement along the way. But actually, it can be roughly halved into two. There is an innovate phase, where we do understand what the problem is. We do a full body scan of actually what the business problem is from a user-centric perspective. So we really understand what are the business needs and the user needs, and we connect the two. And then we define a business opportunity that we want to focus on, and then there is a co-creation phase where we actually work with the client in a sort of agile, iterative way to kind of create a solution that can prove the value of the technology applied to a specific business problem. And crucially, what we do in the co-creation phase, we measure the user value that ensures once the features and the ideas that have been presented in the innovate phase are pushed into production. And the double diamond is there because what we really do is to open and close. So there is an exploratory phase, so we do research, and then we close down, we converge on a business opportunity, and then again we open up again because we explore different things, we iterate with the client, and then we converge again on the MVP, which is the minimum viable product of the solution we are going to design, which is how the product should look like at the end. And it's worth noticing that this kind of process is this kind of framework is very, I should say, unusual or counterintuitive in a sales setting where traditionally, the process has been always represented as a straight line, or I should say as a funnel. So progressively narrowing down to the closure of the deal. But actually in this case, it's completely different. So it's a completely alternative approach to sales that kind of supports sales in a way. I would like to dig a little bit deeper into the role of designers into these. So during the innovation phase, we do, it's really a twofold kind of job, because we do have a more strategic role in the innovate phase where we do research and where we do facilitate. And that's really important, because actually what we do in these engagements that we have with the clients, we do work in multidisciplinary teams because projects are so complex that we actually need to reach out to different experts. And so our teams are very compact, but we actually reach out to different experts because it's really important to have in the room all the disciplines and all the specialisms that are required to kind of break down those wicked problems. And one really important role that we designers have in this multidisciplinary team is actually that of connector, or bridge. So we bridge different specialism, and there's an analogy which is beautiful by Victor Papanek, the famous designer, and he used to say design is a kind of Esperanto language, and this is actually what we can do. What we can do at our best is connecting different languages, connecting different specialism in the room. And then this is the innovate phase. In the co-creation phase, that's the making, and this is where we build those artifacts, we build blueprints, MVPs, prototypes, or something completely different. That could be a conversational AI, so that could be the content for the conversational AI, so something that has a tangible kind of outcome. So far so good, because we touched upon the theory of value-based selling, how he's promising from a sales perspective, but also from an innovation perspective, particularly when paired with design thinking, which is what we do in IBM. But when it comes to implement this kind of approach, value-based selling, that's a different story, because companies, we are seeing that really learning about value-based selling the hard way, and many have only really started to understand the value of things like co-creation or understanding customer needs. So it's quite difficult, despite the bountiful opportunities that this approach brings. It's very difficult to operationalize. And I stumbled upon several studies on the subject, and they all point out to some key challenges for the sales teams to implement this kind of approach. The first is to demonstrate the impact of the solution in the short time frame of a sales process, because we are in the sales process to all intents and purposes. A second challenge lies in the a reluctance or a resistance of sales teams themselves, because as this process tends to be longer than a usual sales process, it might be tedious for sales people who are in a rush or do have tight targets to meet. A third element is around finding quantifiable value elements. So in some projects, it might be difficult to find elements that you can measure the value on. And the third challenge is actually engaging the customer in co-creation. So buying the commitment to share those resources. As I said, co-creation is about sharing resources. So sometimes customers will be reluctant to do so, primarily because they don't know you, they don't trust you, they might share resources that are sensitive, that are actually proprietary. So you need to find a way to build that trust. And I think the answer to these challenges lies in a massive cultural change within organizations, which has to happen at multiple levels. And I tried to jot down a framework for that. The first change that needs to happen at the sales teams level, and there needs to be the sales teams really need to shun the path of least resistance, meaning that when there is a pressure to close the deal, it's all too easy to skip that research, to skip that full body scan of the business opportunity and of users' needs. And it's very easy to default, searching for information about how to frame a problem from a single source of truth. That could be the CRM, that could be the internet, but this often results in a very partial and one-dimensional view of the customer, of the prospect, and of the problems they are trying to solve. So it's really important that we ingrain that kind of value-based culture into sales teams, and this comes down also to there needs to be a rethinking of how the sales process works, and also of the structures around the sales process. So primarily how salespeople are measured. So what are the metrics of value performance? These needs to be tweaked in order to accommodate for value-based selling kind of practices. A second point that needs to change is promoting an understanding of design thinking within the sales teams and the leadership teams. The message that has to pass is that design thinking is a solution-based approach to solving problems, and it combines desirability from a human perspective with technology feasibility and with economic viability. And for that reason, it really helps solve problems that are not conventionally associated to design. And I always love to refer to this framework. This is Richard Buchanan, the co-author of design, and it really shows how design really encompasses everything that goes from the physical to the intangible, touching upon processes and systems. And this is really what we need to kind of nail down at every level of organizations to really make them understand that design thinking is much more used and is increasingly successfully used also in innovation and in strategic context. And in that respect, I would like to highlight something, because design thinking works in a particular way, which is more abductive, and this has a profound impact on sales strategy when you apply it. So traditionally, there are two strategies. One in the sales, regarding sales. One is a more a kind of deductive kind of strategy or push strategy, whereby the supplier kind of assumes what customer needs are, and so they provide an optimal solution. And that was the case of technical sales, or feature selling. Another kind of approach is an inductive kind of sales, which is more a pull sales, where you basically ask your customer, what is it that you need? And your customers say you what they assume they need. But value-based selling says, no, we both know what the needs are, or what the needs that we should focus on are, what is the best opportunity that we should pursue, and therefore we are going to sit together, we are going to frame this opportunity together, and we're going to co-create a solution. So it's not deductive, it's not inductive, it's an abductive kind of approach. So it's based on hypothesis and validation of those hypotheses, and this is precisely how also design thinking works. So how design thinking can really tweak the sales process. And it's really important also to send the message to the sales teams that it doesn't have to be value-based selling all the time, because sometimes problems are really well defined. They're not wicked problems, so you might resort to either of the first two approaches. In some cases, that might be just you use a deductive kind of approach, a push kind of approach, or an inductive kind of approach. But in some other cases, value-based selling, particularly when you have to deal with wicked problems, it is particularly helpful and is particularly meaningful also. Another change that needs to happen is actually making sure that everyone in organizations, both buyers and sellers, understand what user centricity really is. And it's actually really fascinating to see in every engagement that we're going to have that the best business opportunities and the most pressing business needs always invariably comes down to addressing a user's need. And actually, I think this concept of user centricity is really well captured by in this quote by legend Vivienne Westwood. Sadly, she left us weeks ago. This is from a very old interview where she was kind of commenting on the apparent decline of haute culture in the 90s, and she famously bemoaned fashion houses because they don't design with a woman's body in mind. They spend a fortune on prototypes that actually can't be worn by anyone. It's just the idea of a beautiful product. But luckily, there are still a few, and she actually appointed herself to be one of those few who still care to design something that when a woman wears it and walks down the street, nobody will look more wonderful than that woman. And I think this is the key message is that you really need to design stuff that will benefit the life of someone and the work of someone along the line, at some point along the line. Actually, one of the difficult sometimes in communicate the value of a user-centric culture is to really to define this word user, because sometimes we tend to think of user in terms of the end user, so the one who pushes buttons on an interface, or the one who, or the end users in end market. And actually in an IT setting, for instance, or in a B2B kind of scenario, it might be more difficult to identify what the user actually is, particularly in the IT world, that sometimes you just have agents, you have systems that are benefited by a particular solution. But actually, what's important to communicate is that whatever you do, however solution you implement, there's always someone being benefited along the way at some point in the process. There's always someone pushing those applications, pushing those systems, and your value proposition needs to be tweaked around that. This is also important also to think in kind of human terms, to kind of scope down what you want to do into an MVP, because you're going to measure that MVP in terms of the benefit accrued to a real user when your solution is in production. And one last point is about this MVP and scoping down to the MVP, because actually, as I said, you don't have 6 months to carry out a project in a value-based selling scenario. You are still in a value-based, in a selling kind of a process. So you really need to close the deal. So, and you might have 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or some weeks to kind of close the deal. So what you need to do is to actually scope down on something that it's enough to kind of show the value, but at the same time has the power to really make you envision what could be a future roadmap. So what could be a solution in the future, and what could be the implication on your ecosystem, and how can you scale up from this small portion, from this small bite of the cake, what could be the cake in the future. So what's going to be your innovation journey in the future, starting from this small experiment, so to speak. And so just to wrap up, value-based selling can be a transformative approach to sales, particularly when paired with design thinking, and can really transform the sales process into a path to innovation, which is grounded and rooted in users' needs and in the value that accrues to users. And it really allows all parties to envision future ecosystems. And at the same time, it really also allows for companies to implement these agile experiments that are really fit into this space and time, whereas this, the time to market and the pace of innovation, all of these, this is really tough for companies now. And value-based selling really proves to be a way also for them to effectively try out new solutions and experiment, and then with the mindset that everything is a prototype, nothing is never really done, and you can always improve along the way. And it's absolutely, from a designer's perspective, this is absolutely one of the most interesting spaces to be in at the moment. Thank you for listening me, and apologies for the glitches that we had earlier. And thank you. I'm curious to hear if there are questions or comments around this topic. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. No, that is actually, it's a topic that I'm really, really massively interested in, because I do think it's a better way of working, and I have so many questions of how does it actually work in practice. But before I jump into my questions, there was a question from Mihaela who asked, can you expand a bit on the perfect design solution for that need, which was seen in phase 2 of the workflow diagram? And I think what it was you were talking about your kind of design thinking, where you're trying to you come up with a wicked problem, and then you need to experiment and kind of get the empathy and understand what that solution could be.
Yeah, I didn't quite catch the first part of the question. What page are you referring to?
It was phase 2 of the workflow diagram.
Oh, yeah.
And the question was, can you expand a bit on the perfect design solution for that need?
Yeah. So that's really, when I said that value-based selling is the last incarnation of solution selling, because actually what you do, you really start from what the needs are of the business. But actually what you want to do is to kind of find out what is the best business opportunity to pursue. And the best business opportunity usually is always related to some sort of user need. And the best solution that you can develop is something that kind of meets the business need and users need in the middle, and it really allows you to ground that design into into an improvement of a human condition. In a way, that could be an employee, that could be a customer, that could be a third party, a stakeholder. But by doing so, you're really able to make it concrete in a way, make it tangible, and you can measure it in a way. You can put numbers behind it, so it's more concrete. I don't know if that answered your question, but actually, it really comes down when you do have a wicked problem. You really need to break it down and always kind of take it down to the user need. And what you do, because you might have a plethora of user needs, you need to prioritize. And that's an activity that you do with your customers. Particularly, as I said, if you want to develop something small, something that you can scale. So that's a good idea. What we do usually, we do prioritize, and we say, this is what we are doing, the MVP, this is what is taken, this is a future goal. So it's really important because you really need to keep an eye also on what you do. You really need to prove something in a short time frame, because you are in a sales process. So you really need to understand what are the most urgent needs that I want to solve. So you prioritize needs or pain points depending on the angle you want to frame it.
Great. I hope, Mihaela, that's answered your question. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We're slightly over, but we had some technical issues, so I let it run a little bit late. But thank you very much, Silvia. I really enjoyed that. I do have a few more questions that I'll post into the Slack channel, and hopefully you've been invited there, so hopefully you'll be able to join us and answer those.
Thank you very much. Thank you.